All right. Well, my title of my study at this point is Preparing for the Unplanned in Higher Education Settings. And this is centers around how professionals on campuses, whether it be, from the academic side, from the student affairs side to, senior level administration, as far as how do they prepare, how do they figure out what they can do to avoid, crisis on campus. And a couple things to address with that is that crisis can be one, man-made as far as, the human interaction with it, but also it can be, human nature, or not human nature, weather, natural causes, whether it be, severe, storms, snow, fire, things of that nature. So the question is, how do professionals actually get to come together and prepare for such things? So the topic of this study, will focus on understanding how campus leaders describe the institutional preparedness for unpredictable incidents, and also how do they utilize, threat assessment or similar teams as it relates to, each campus has their own approach to it. So, we're looking at how do we prepare for the unknown. Makes campus leaders, ask themselves, what is possible? What's possible from their student interaction? What's possible from, the contingencies that they're bringing, or, external experiences that they're bringing to our campuses? What's possible in relation to, say our, if we have a residence life program, or if we have, a commuter program, a strong commuter program, where are risks at, where are opportunities? And then also, leading from that, how do we react? So if an incident does take place, whether it be a flood, or some type of natural disaster, or some type of student in crisis situation, how are we going to react? Who do we have to count on? Who do we have on campus, externally? What's our process and procedures?
Craig, let
And
me
then also,
interject really quickly before you get too far in. Can you increase the size of your presentation? We see exactly what's on your screen, so as you talk, just make it a little larger, or start the presentation. Yeah. Thank you so
okay,
much.
do you see that? Because it's shown on my full screen here.
Oh, it is. Okay.
Um,
Um,
Let me see.
there's a bottom at the button. I mean, a button at the bottom. A button at the bottom, maybe to increase the actual. There, yeah, there you go.
Okay,
Yeah, you don't have
okay,
to make it that large. I can't see it
okay.
now, but
Just 100%?
it was at 20%, so we couldn't.
Okay,
If you dial it down to maybe about 70%, I think we'll 60 or 70% will be fine.
okay. How's that?
A little less actually now, probably. Um, yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay,
Thank you. I'm sorry
my
for
apologies.
interjecting.
That's okay. So let's see here. And also in relation to the research topic, it centers on, what are institutions cognizant of as it relates to what their vulnerabilities are, what their strengths are, and how do they utilize, the knowledge moving forward. So as we get into the research statement, in the wake of several large-scale incidents of crisis, across the nation in recent, or not recent years, but in the early 2000s, people started to ask questions. Um, you know, the examples here, who could have prevented this? How can we, change this from happening? What resources are available to, everybody in place? And that's where we started to see the development of these different threat assessment teams, or something of similar nature, across the, nation, where people said, oh, we need to do something about this. And that's where, this institution's doing it, we're going to take the opportunity to do it too. And it has become a common practice, from what I've seen, from my professional experience. Since 2007, I'm working at my third institution, and even immediately after, Virginia Tech took place, that's when the institution I was at then, took the initiative to say, okay, we need to put together a team. And then when the team got put together, they said, now what? So, and then I was actually part of the original team at my last institution. So this is, and I'll talk more about that in the positionality component, but it's the, where are we at the now what as it relates to the development of these teams. So we also need to look at, what are the directives, the procedures, documentation, if they do, have any documentation. And, modes to address warning signs and also to avoid escalation of situations on campuses, as it relates to, the human interactions. So moving forward, the primary research questions, and based on our last conversation, Q1, how do campus leaders describe institutional preparedness for unplanned events? That's definitely, a good start. And I also wanted to narrow it down a little bit as it relates to, my sample or proposed sample is, what are the practices of these teams that are prevalent at medium-sized institutions. One of the documents I did share with you was the questions as it relates to the interview itself. There are going to be a few introduction questions to help, set the stage for the conversation, but I also added the sub-questions associated with the study, what I plan on asking the individuals in the conversation. So, just running through these real quick. How long have you led the threat assessment team? What are the major concerns or issues with development of it? How often do you meet? Because sometimes frequency may play a role in how student concerns are addressed or external concerns. So we're going to talk about structure. How who serves on it, for what purposes, things of that nature. And then when was it first formed? And at that point, I want to be able to determine the timeline associated with the when incidents first became national spotlight and how other institutions were addressing them or trying to prevent them. Let's see. I want to see how that timeline fell into place for other schools. Did we talk about the composition of the team? Changes in the group, and on the team as over time, inquire why, and then also see what impact it did have. And then we're looking at some longitudinal items as it relates to changes in the group, from when it was first created, whether that be 10 years ago or even longer ago, but looking at the 10-year time frame and also 5 years 5 years ago versus now. A couple different certifications or training opportunities that individuals can have is the point of questions 9 and 10. So NIM certifications, which is the National Institute Management System, whether or not people are certified in that, that's a free opportunity. Then the BETA certifications and the trainings, those is an independent group that there's some fees associated with their training programs and resources. So I would like to get a feeling for institutions as far as which ones are they attempting to utilize. And then lastly, since the creation of the group, what changes have they seen on their campuses? Have they seen incidents lower? Have they seen more resources being available to students? Maybe students that have things needs that need to be met. And is that making a positive difference or reducing the amount of stress and anxiety, as it relates to certain situations. Justification as it relates to the study. In the 10 years since Virginia Tech, institutions have been charged with developing these teams. But we need to, determine what do we know about the procedures and practices, and then hopefully through the study, we'll be able to identify, some commonly used ones, or frequently used, I don't want to say best practices, but frequently used practices, because I honestly feel it might be too early to say, what are best practices, but we can say, most frequently used or highly effective practices. Purpose and significance. The significance of this research, would help to the relative newness of this, team, this entity on a campus, and hopefully we can expand on what we can share about, what the specific segment of medium-sized schools are doing, but also as general it can be shared with anyone as it relates to how they convey information, how they share information. And I made note that the examples have been created for what models should look like, but there's no organizing body. There's no whether it be a state oversight committee or a national oversight. It's something that each campus is, relatively homegrown. Not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but at the same point in time, it could, be an opportunity to have, information shared, that would benefit everybody. As it relates to positionality, myself as the student researcher in this experience, I'm approaching it from 4 different perspectives. Gave some timeline here as far as the my background, from 2007 to 2008. After our team was formed at the campus I was at, I was a reporter. I worked in the residence halls. I worked with supervised hall directors as well, and we were there to share information as it related to student behavior, things that we were aware of, external forces that we were aware of, and share that, run that up the ladder, if you will. So our director, our chief of police, through the vice president of student affairs, they were made aware of the information that we were aware of. Also have approaching it from the perspective as a volunteer firefighter. So from 2007 to 2014, I was part of 2 different companies of fire departments, and received hundreds of hours of training as it relates to those practices. So from emergency response methods, approaches. Mentioned a few of the certifications and training areas. I'm a firefighter. I have Firefighter 1 certification, so that's something that I could take nationwide and have that opportunity to become a professional firefighter if I had the opportunity. Have hazardous materials training. I'm a vehicle rescue technician in the state of Pennsylvania, so the jaws of life make things easier, but we can actually tear apart a car with a screwdriver and a hammer. So and also in New York State, I was taking classes for arson investigation and fire investigation. So just a little bit of my background as it relates to that approach, as relating to crisis, how to respond, and the policies and procedures that emergency services would approach things with. From 2008 to 2013, I was actually part of the behavior intervention team, as it was term there, and that was at my previous institution. I was a director of housing at my previous institution, so relatively smaller scale. We had just around 1,000 students on campus, usually in the fall, a little bit less in the spring, but we were, we made sure that we were aware of what was going on with the students, from a larger scale perspective. We weren't, obviously interfering with their lives, but if something was brought to our attention, or, we were aware of something, it was a group that would address those situations. And from 2013 to present, I'm actually serve as a faculty member in my current role, and I've been it's at a larger institution as well, so my role has been pretty much pulled right, like I don't have any involvement per se with the the role of this team that I'm at my current campus. So which is kind of beneficial to a point, because I'm not as close to the situation, so it might make the research side of it a little bit more objective, if you will. This is the part that I realized I made a mistake on. So theoretical framework. After looking into it a little bit more, started, finding this situational awareness idea keep popping up. And basically, situational awareness theory is understanding what's going on around you, and as it relates from a dynamic perspective, and then from that point, how that's going to influence your decision making. So from what I've found out about the framework, it was first used in pilot training for airline pilots, and it's adapted to several professions and settings since then. So they were finding that pilots were, as they were training and or experiencing issues while flying, there was a lot of things that they needed to be aware of and be cognizant of. As I was reflecting on the presentation for today, I can relate a little personal experience with that, because one of my first college classes was actually a flight class, an aviation class. So having flown planes before, this is, can relate strongly to it. So being aware of, the things around you. So we talk about, perception, and how that, either perception, having keen perception or lack of perception can cause for misaction or lack of action on the, part of the operator. So as it relates to the question at hand, how are professionals, threat assessment teams perceiving, different actions of students or, different, stimulus that might be, interacting with the campus. Next part is comprehension, the interpretation and integration of a variety of pieces of data and determining, what's relevant, what's not, and how is this going to impact our goals and objectives as an institution. From the moving on to the projection, the ability to forecast, actions and events, basically understanding, the dynamic system, and if you do X action, it's going to have the Y response. So how, what's going to be the best step forward. And then these all impact the decisions that are made. They use the term operator in a lot of the text, but as it relates to this team or the person's in charge of this opportunity, not the opportunity per se, but in the situation, how do they handle the decisions based off of, the first three items, the perception, comprehension, and projection? Where is this, what's going to be the best outcome? And what develops from, the first four areas is experience. And this is, helpful as it relates to building future decisions or, making future decisions. Because sometimes, we labor over, could be considered a minor decision at one point, but there's a lot of different pieces of information we need to take into play. Once we learn from that decision, once we learn from those actions and reactions, we can, use that, make that decision a lot quicker, or, adjust that, for future situations. So the methodology to identify how institutions are utilizing their teams, how they're functioning, changes and all that. We're approaching it from the qualitative approach, and the use of qualitative, looks at human interactions. And so within that, we're talking about the narrative inquiry as it relates to, listening to the stories, listening to the, experiences, and being able to retell that as it relates to, the experiences at hand. Typically with narrative inquiry, information is gathered through the use of conversation, observation, and fact-checking. And fact-checking is, one thing that can help with that validity, adding validity to the data that's collected. So, through this, the results of the, of the conversations and, observations and subsequent items, they're shared in a common story. And for the purpose of this study, I've created an outline as it relates to each individual story, how I'm going to be able to, take the components of that information and add it to the, or rate a common story with each of the participants. Moving forward, the additional information on the methodology, the recruitment of participants, and one of the addendums, or the appendix, I'm sorry, one had the, recruitment email as it relates to, I'm searching for this, person that serves to this role on your campus. Establishing the date and time, once we can, establish that, conversation or identify that person. The completion of the signed informed consent form, which can be found as Appendix 2. In the methodology chapter, we made sure that we covered as much information as possible and also adhered to the Northeastern guidelines for creating such document. The interview would be conducted, and the proposed method is going to be through Skype. My concern was if I did it through the GoToMeeting platform, is that if I recorded the interviews, it would be, the data would be, or the video could be held in a third-party location, which I didn't believe was as secure as potentially doing it through Skype and then just doing an audio recording of the interview. From that point, we go through the transcribing of the interview responses, making sure that we have all the, responses, in detail recorded, and then at that point, we would proceed with the retelling of the stories. Once the stories are or once the accounts are, restored, if you will, then I would be also utilizing software in vivo to assist with coding, identifying themes, and really looking at the seeing what commonalities there are from the different experiences. And I would like to, be able to say I'd like to find out X, Y, and Z as far as hypothesis, but I think to let that organically come together would be important as it relates to the study. And I believe this may be the last slide, the audience and stakeholders. The intended audience is first and foremost, professionals who serve on these teams, across the nation. And, if we can share this information as it relates to, it's a small sample, but there's still practices that people can take away from. One time I was at a conference and someone says, well, student affairs, if it's not original, you borrowed it from someone else. And, this is excellent information to share. Senior student affairs officials or officers would definitely benefit from this as an intended audience, and then aspiring student affairs professionals is going to be very helpful, because I don't believe this is going to be a field that's going to shrink as far as its use and effectiveness on a college campus. So if we can train those upcoming and rock stars, if you will, in student affairs, so they can be prepared for the different situations they may encounter. That would be very helpful. Stakeholders, it's a little bit different. So the stakeholders, the way I view it is current students on college and university campuses, because their safety is a concern. Their persistence in college is a concern, and if we can't provide the safe environments for that, then we may not be able to have that opportunity. So first and foremost, students are a huge stakeholder. Following that is administrators, faculty, staff that maintain institutions. We know that we can't run an institution just based on having students there. We need to have all the pieces of the machine together, working together, in order to sustain. And so as we look at safety on campus, we need to make sure that these individuals are included in that as well. Third set of stakeholders, parents and family members of students, and these are the ones that are in this generation. They're connected by an electronic means that's just unbelievable. Students calling, texting, and other forms of social media with their parents constantly. So we need to make sure that these parents are aware that they are in a safe environment. And lastly, the last group of stakeholders include organizations and businesses who rely on colleges, and that's not just the businesses in the town, but it could be when you look at textbooks, when you look at supply companies as it relates, it can be anything from janitorial supplies to security systems to computers, you name it. Those companies and businesses rely on an institution thriving or at least sustaining. So we need to make sure that from a stakeholder's perspective that we include them as well. And then the reference list is listed there. So at this point, I'd like to thank you for your patience in this presentation, and I look forward to comments and suggestions moving forward.
Okay, thank you so much. I think Dr. Margaret is going to come back on in a second here. One of the things I was just kind of reflecting on, I know that you've looked at this from your own positionality is kind of a unique position. Definitely understand the need for the role and the research, because again, it's something that I think maybe 10 or 20, 30 years ago no one really considered. How we have what we call crisis teams, or you have your local folks on campus that do police departments and stuff, but not really the magnitude of what we're now facing in our society, especially from a student affairs and campus safety approach. So this is very timely. I'm going to defer to you, Dr. Margaret, with your first questions. I have a couple questions and maybe we'll touch on the same ones, and I'll defer to you first.
Great. Yeah, again, Craig, thanks. That was a thoughtful presentation. So, and I don't think there's the argument about the relevancy of the topic. So that's certainly, without getting academic, tell me who you're going to talk to and what are the questions, how many people, and what are just the general, what are you hoping to get?
Okay. What my intention is to I've identified 10 institutions that I want to reach out to. The
10?
actual individuals.
Okay. 10 universities.
Yes.
Okay.
And at each institution is where I would identify, who their threat assessment team leader would be, and that would be the individual I'd like to have a conversation with.
Okay, so let me just stop you there. So your goal is to eventually get 10. So you might reach out to 20. And you're going to talk to one person at each of these institutions. Is that right?
I was originally going to reach out to the 10 institutions as it related to peer institutions to my current place of employment. So the sample size I was anticipating was going to be 10, but I can widen that to.
No. It's kind of like you plan a party. You always invite more people.
Okay.
Because a bunch of them are going to drop out. What do you hope is your final number?
I originally was thinking of 10, but if I can get at least 6 to 8 conversations in place, that would be able to at least start the
So
process.
you're hoping to have 6 to 8. So really your population is, you're hoping to have conversations with 6 to 8 threat assessment managers from different institutions.
Correct.
Okay. So that will be something that you need to be clear on, especially with your stuff to Kate. Like, it wasn't clear to me that that's what you're looking for. And I think it's reasonable and narrative. We usually do a range. I tend to tell students 8 to 12,
Okay.
but I'll defer to Brian, on that. If it's 6 to 10, you could say 6 to 10, with the idea that 6 is your minimum. So, and Kate will also want to know, how you can, so you're going to reach out to your peer network. So you're going to have 6 to 8 of these conversations with individuals. Okay. And it's going to be their individual perception on their institutional preparedness.
Correct.
And to understand that you're using the situational awareness framework.
Yes. As it relates to the different variables that they involve in their decision making, and also how they, come to those conclusions.
Model. This is the model.
Yes.
It's a pretty extensive model.
It is, and I also explored utilizing a couple other ones, Bloom's taxonomy, and Ambrose's elements.
I'm not saying and Bloom's taxonomy is a learning theory.
Learning theory.
This is the right theory. It's just it's a decision making theory. And it's got some set factors, right? We've got a whole bunch of factors. So you're going to ask questions around how they're understanding these different, what are there, like 13 different factors. So your interview protocol will be centered on these.
It was, the questions that, that I originally, came up with were designed to, gain from, get their experience, and then, apply to see how this, theoretical lens can be um, how that was implemented or utilized, as far as, outside variables, timing, what was known, what's unknown, in their decision-making process.
And I'm just wondering, if this is your theoretical framework, why wouldn't you use this to structure your interview questions?
That's something that we can definitely realign in the question portion. I was hoping to be able to gain some insight from the professionals that I interview to see how their experience relates to this model. Is there any type of reflection or any type of consideration of the outside variables as it relates to their decision-making process and how they address situations of concern.
Right, so they've got environment on here in their model, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that's your piece. You're looking more at all the way to the left, how they're understanding their environment and the extent to which they kind of perceive these external stuff, understand it, and then look for the future. That's the part of the model that you're paying it more attention to.
Yeah. So the box to the left where it says the situational awareness and has those three components that we're looking at, trying to understand from the professional side of it, how are they utilizing the various elements moving towards that decision-making process, and have practices changed over time as it relates to the building of experience and knowledge.
So why is that part important?
As it relates to,
yeah, because I'm only asking that because that second piece that you're adding on is a big piece, because you're trying to understand the extent to which their experience over time impacts how they understand the situation. That then is a different theory.
Mm-hmm.
Because now you're really trying to understand how they leverage their expertise.
Mm-hmm.
How are they as a reflective practitioner now making decisions about, and so it's just a different kind of question.
okay.
So here's my thing, and I don't want to try and be too difficult. I feel like you've got like 3 studies going.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry, say that again?
I feel like you've got 3 different dissertations.
Okay.
And I don't want you to have 3 different dissertations.
Okay.
I want you to be able to be done.
Yeah, we'd like that too. So how would you suggest?
Well, so I'm just trying to find out what the most important part of this is for you.
That's what I was going to mention too. It seems like you have looking at that model is very, what do I say, it's layered. It's several layers of that model. So
Mm-hmm.
I guess to Dr. Margaret's question, you still have 2, I guess, major questions here as it relates to even to your presentation. Which one is the most salient as it relates to what you really want to hope to learn? Because again, if you're approaching this from a best practices approach, you're saying, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, based on these folks who are in place, these are the best practices that they have shared based on their either role and title, and also understanding, their knowledge, just like your knowledge of the experience,
Mm-hmm.
which is slightly different. Um, one of your questions, and I'm looking at the same one, is that,
Yeah, and so I think what you've got in 4 and 5, slides 4 and 5,
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
your questions are really your interview questions. So research questions.
Those were my interview questions. I apologize for the mislabeling.
Okay, yeah, because your research question is what's the overall thing that you're trying to understand. And so the overall thing you want to, and really it's not how do campus leaders describe, it's how do threat assessment managers describe
Mm-hmm.
their institutional preparedness. That's who you're talking to, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think you want to be that succinct with that. Because campus leaders make it sound like, oh, you're going to talk to a VP of operations, and you're going to talk to someone in student life, and you're going to talk. You're not. You're talking to the threat assessment managers.
Yes.
And how do they understand their institutional preparedness for unplanned events? And maybe one of the sub-questions is more around this idea, how do they reflect on their role of experience, the role of their experience in refining how their situational awareness impacts their decisions.
I'm just taking notes on. I apologize.
Because so this is what you're talking about. This is what you said. It's part of the models. And you have this theory that over time maybe they're modifying it. So again, if this is fine for an overall question, how do campus leaders decide, or how do threat assessment managers describe their institutional preparedness for unplanned events? That's really important because you don't want them talking about everything. You don't want them giving your, you don't want to take on too much. It's for the unplanned events.
Focus on unplanned.
And then the second piece is then this idea of this over time. Maybe it's, whatever, to what extent do these threat assessment managers describe the role of their experience over time in refining the process of situational awareness in relation to decisions.
Okay. Refinement.
So basically you're going to talk to them and you're going to say you've been in this role. You'll get some background information from them, probably in their preliminary interview, to make sure that they meet your criteria and stuff like that. And so I'm envisioning the first part of your interview is just getting them familiar with, their role, their background. But then you want to talk to, can you share with me, just in general, what you see are the ways in which your institution plans for unplanned events. And you're going to have a series of probes because they might be like, what are you talking about? Do you mean like shootings, or do you mean like we have a lice outbreak? Do you mean about bullying? Do you mean about
bed bugs?
I mean, are you going to keep it open that they can talk about anything? Because those are all unplanned events. University of Virginia, scandal with the fraternities, blah, blah, blah. Duke University's lacrosse piece. I mean, there are things that take over universities. Are you keeping it open to it can be anything?
I was mainly approaching it from like, I guess crisis is, can be applied to any of those examples. My primary interest was, or looking at it was, incidents of, like large-scale incidents, emergency type situations. So okay, I guess I need to refine that.
Right. So if that's what you want to look at, again, that's another word I'd add in there. How do threat assessment managers describe the institutional preparedness for unplanned emergency events or emergency crisis? And again, some institutions would consider things like date rape and fraternities and other things as that, but that's not what you're talking about.
Not specifically, no.
Okay, and that's okay. So you're just getting more refined, so that so that they're not talking. And then you have this other idea that maybe that has changed over time. And so back to your interview protocol, you might talk to them about, can you describe a time when you were first getting in this role, and your first emergency event occurred? How did you understand that process? And have them describe it. Okay, now in your current role, can you describe a recent emergency event in the last couple of years and how that? And then you have them do a future event, so imagine it's 5 years from now, and ideally you've built the capacity of your university to handle any unplanned emergency crisis. What would that look like? And just by asking your participants these 3 points of time, past, present, future, it's going to give you that piece you're interested in, this shaping over time piece. So I think some of these other things you have in here, I'm not sure why you're talking about the group, the team. So again, I see the words like group and team, and I'm like, oh, okay, so now is he talking about team theory? This is your third dissertation, comprising of the group. And then I'm not sure what this requirement MIS and NABT, these seem like some things that when you reach out to these potential participants, you can ask them some of this stuff right then.
Okay.
Like, you don't need to waste their time in the interview. These are kind of like yes/no questions.
Okay. So would you suggest making a pre-interview questionnaire?
Well, so what you'll, and I think you have Elizabeth Muller's dissertation. For narrative, a lot of times what they do is they talk about 3 rounds of interviews. The first round, they call it a preliminary interview. And what you do during that is you contact potential participants, you confirm they meet your criteria. That's the number 2. Number 3, you get their informed consent. And number 4, you ask some quick background information. How long have you been with your institution? How long have you been in threat assessments, as a whole? Sometimes these people move around. And then if you've got a couple other, but you can ask these through an email. I don't call it a survey because you don't want to be doing mixed methods. It's a preliminary interview. You just happen to be doing it via email, or you could do it via phone. But go ahead and get that quick, any of the background information.
Okay.
How long have they been at their institution? How long have they been in that role at their institution? How long have they been in that field in general? You might even want to ask, like you, who have a background in, fire, do you have a history at all in any other emergency services? That seems like that might be an important piece. So get all that stuff as part of this preliminary interview. And then the 5th thing that you do during this preliminary interview is you schedule the interview itself.
Okay.
So those are the 5 things that we do in this preliminary interview, and so you can just lay that stuff out.
Okay.
And then I go ahead.
I'm sorry. The name of that individual you said, as far as a copy.
Elizabeth Muller. I'll send Brian that dissertation, or you and Brian. She's on faculty with us. She did narrative research, and that's just what, so that's kind of like your first round of what we'll call interviews, just confirming they meet your criteria, you get their informed consent, yes, some preliminary background, and you schedule their interview.
Okay.
Part 2 is the main interview, and that's where you want to capture these stories, like, the past, present, future. Tell me about a time when, what was that story, blah, blah, blah. What were the things that you looked for? And I think in your probes, because you have this model, you're not testing the model, but you might, if they don't describe those things when they're sharing their story, you should have those probes ready.
Okay. Right.
Like, oh, was there another, factor you considered, or let's see what things they have in there. Were there other elements in the situation, did you hold the knowledge, like a comprehensive knowledge, or was it through conversations with other individuals that helped you build that comprehensive knowledge? Okay. As you were assessing the situation, how did you feel that might impact future ones, Anyway, so that's where you can get into some of this other stuff. And then, you know, and I think your other piece around this over time, that's really this bottom part of the model is around this memory, right?
Mm-hmm.
So really, I think question 1 is testing this
Okay.
part.
Up to the decision and the circular.
Up to the decision. And so you might want to even, you know, have a few probes ready, you know, again, around some of these other stuff. And then really your sub-question 2 is around this stuff, their background and their experiences, and how that impacts their decision.
Yeah.
That's how I'm understanding your study.
Okay.
And then really the third interview, we call it an interview, the third interview, what you'll do is, I don't know if you're going to use RevWorks or something to transcribe your interviews. I strongly encourage that.
What's the name of that again?
RevWorks, R-E-V, RevWorks,
Okay.
R-E-V-W-R. A lot of my students do that. So what they do is they audio record, and then they email the file to RevWorks. And RevWorks turns around the transcription within 48 hours. It's awesome.
Wow.
And then what the students do, so round 3 is really you send that transcript back to the participant just to say, you know, I want to confirm, you know, you're comfortable. This is your transcript. Was there any changes that you want to make? If I don't hear from you, I'll assume you're okay.
Okay.
And then you can, so that's question 1, so they're confirming that. And then question 2 might be, do you have any other reflections at all about, you know, things that institutions might do to enhance their preparedness? And so it just gives them like a, you know, some of them, I'd say out of your 8, maybe 1 might respond to that question. And they might say, yeah, I really forgot. After we talked, I thought about blah, blah, blah. And again, this can be all via email. So I think your first and third are via email or phone call. And I think in your stuff to Kate and in your proposal, you just do, you know, it'll be a blend of electronic, you know, and or audio or whatever. You know, you can keep it vague.
Okay. Would you suggest one or over the other as far as over the phone versus via, you know, telecommunications?
I think for these folks, over the phone is perfectly fine.
Okay. Okay.
They're gonna, yeah. I think that's, university folks are busy people.
Okay.
If you can do a couple face-to-face, that's great. And definitely test out your questions.
Yes.
Pilot it. That's something you can do while you're waiting to hear from Kate. Create your interview protocol. I'd say have around 10 interview questions, you know, and test them out with, you know, a friend or a spouse or a neighbor. It doesn't really matter. But just like run through it, test your equipment, and then also give them a copy of the interview questions and have them circle any words that they were confused about or right next to it what they think you thought you were asking. You know, because I think we tend to get very academic. We tend to make our students very academic, and they forget about how to talk plain
speak. Humans. Yeah,
you know conceptually what you're testing, but you don't want to use situational awareness in your interview protocol.
Right.
You plain speak to these individuals.
Okay.
All right, I know I'm dominating, but those would be my recommendations. So I think it just in summary, it would be modify your second research question. You know, maybe it's just what's the role of memory? Maybe that's it. What's the role of memory in refining threat assessment managers' approach to decision making? Because memory is the word in the model. That makes it more direct link. And so that would be 1, just the second sub-research question. 2 would be just to modify your interview protocol to have 10 questions that do this, like, you know, past, present, future type. And then I think 3 is just get clearer, more succinct about your sample. That's all Kate cares about. That you're going to the study, you're going to try and interview 6 to 10 threat assessment managers at different mid-size institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And you're going to use your personal network and then a snowball sample. Snowball sample basically means if you call your friend Jimmy and Jimmy says, you know what, Susie will do this too,
Mm-hmm.
you
Mm-hmm.
give up each other's names. So, and then I would add in this RevWorks. I don't know, it's up to Brian, but it's money well spent. It'll cost you, but I think it's just money well spent, to be honest.
Okay.
And then my other advice to you is just, you wrote a lot about documents, and I think you could spend a lot of time. I don't think this dissertation is about you evaluating their programs.
Right.
So you want to ease that's not what you're not looking for secret, you're not evaluating their programs or how well they're doing. You're just trying to understand, are there some innovative practices that threat managers are using
Mm-hmm.
to help build our capacity for the future? So put them at ease.
Okay.
And so, other than understanding the university and how long they've had this threat management office set up, I personally don't think you need to do too much with documents.
Okay.
You're going to have your hands full with these 6 to 10 interviews. And like I said, your job isn't, that's your fourth dissertation would be to evaluate. Your job isn't to evaluate these, it's to capture the stories of these threat managers' experiences in dealing with unplanned emergency crisis.
Okay. So need to narrow it down, focus on those, just the individual approach to one part of this, and then go from there. Okay. Thank you very much.
That's my suggestion. And I'm okay. I don't need to see another version, work with Brian. I'm all about, I think Brian and I are both about, get this form into Kate. She
Mm-hmm.
just needs basic information. You're interviewing 6 to 10 threat managers at different universities. You're going to, you could even send her the draft of your current pilot questions.
Right.
Just call them pilot.
Okay.
And that you're going to use RevWorks. I think that's enough. She doesn't even, you don't send her your proposal. You don't send her your PowerPoint.
Yeah, and I've watched the video like 3 or 4 times as far as how to prepare that document, and I know that she wants it very non-academic.
Yes.
In that approach. So
Right.
That's great.
that.
Yeah, so I think get that off to Kate as soon as you can, and so that part, she's a couple of weeks reviewing stuff, and then
Mm-hmm.
in the meantime, rework your interview questions, test those out, start, you can preliminarily ask for potential participants or volunteers,
Okay.
I think. And then that way once Kate says it's a go, you've got some of your stuff set up so you can start collecting your data.
Okay. I didn't want to, reach out to people too soon because I didn't want to.
Well,
I
it's
don't want to cross IRB, so.
No, you're not, so don't use the word participant. You're just calling to test their potential willingness to be a volunteer.
Okay.
Stay away from the word participant. It's just their potential willingness to be a volunteer. When your study gets approved, that's all you're doing.
Potential willingness to.
To be a volunteer
Okay.
when their study gets approved. Don't use the word participant. That's the naughty word.
Volunteer, that's the important one.
Yes.
Okay. Potential willingness to be a volunteer when study is approved. I just want to make sure I get the language correct.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
So my feedback, I think Dr. Margaret reached a lot of the points there, just kind of really clarifying your study. I mean, again, looking at the model, I was like, okay, how are you going to really go through all of these pieces of this and actually make it applicable to your study? So I'm not going to rehash a lot of the points that she's already made. A couple issues or concerns that I have, you also mentioned with your chapter 3 about using Skype and how you wanted to incorporate that. But again, I think to simplify this, phone calls I think would be easier. Also with Skype, far as recording and all of that, security is important. Again, you want to make sure folks who are going to be volunteers for the study feel at ease, and if they say something on camera or something that is off the beaten path, there's not going to be something that resurfaces or something of that nature. And I'm not using Skype, for that purpose, or how it's now being restructured. I don't think is probably the most applicable approach anyway. The other thing about the actual number, I was agreeing with Margaret that you want to plan to for the worst that you may or may not get those participants. If you say 10, you're not going to guarantee to get those 10. So expanding it to in general with a range. But as it relates to the actual number, I think 6 to 8 would be great. 8 would be wonderful because I think that gives you a nice balancing point of getting enough participants, and also that should be reflective of perspectives of different universities. And again, I think that that's where my goal would be. If you say, hey, we're close, if you get even 7, and a range of 7 to 10 would be great.
Okay. Would you suggest reaching out to like 12 to 20 institutions or individuals first? Would that be a better party invite, if you will?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. And I think Dr. Margaret mentioned that completely to her credit. Naturally, that's how you would plan the party and make sure that you do get the type of participation that you're seeking. The other thing is that we probably will go back and view some of the connection points for the model to your study. I think that those are the things we want to, and Margaret alluded to this, how to make sure that your study is now tied to your questions. So again, as we're both in agreement of moving forward, but also on the back end, we need to go back and retool some of those connector points so that your actual framework does support your study. Does that
make it more streamlined?
Yes, absolutely. We have, as what was mentioned, you have multiple things going on there. So you want to simplify it to a point that, hey, this equals this, and this is how we're approaching this, or using the model to ask the questions or to get the data that you're seeking. Oftentimes, if you say, hey, I'm trying to find out, if you, and to simplify it, it's like, well, what is your long-term memory account of this? People are going to say, what are you talking about? So make it very simple and, just like we're having a casual conversation, but it does fill that bucket, as we say, those 3 or 4 buckets, as you kind of break your study down. So that's something that we'll talk about a little bit more. We'll also create, I would say, some work.
To that end, I like graphics.
Yeah.
I think you put his model up and maybe draw a circle around, the first part and put on top of it research question 1, and maybe that's a blue circle.
Yes.
And then a model around the second part and put research question 2. Put that in your theoretical framework in chapter 1, and then in chapter 5 you have to come back and match up your findings with it. You read that graphic and say, okay, so here was their story about this part, and then here was their story about this part.
Okay.
You were reading my mind. I was about to say that. I was like, you need to figure out how we will break it into smaller chunks, or like you said, maybe put a circle around it. I guess that's the easiest way. So graphically, we are able to, see which one you're addressing, because again, that's going to lead to your chapter 5 in saying, okay, we're answering as succinctly as possible each one of these questions. And again, I know that you pulled this together. We've had a couple conversations and how we got to just be consistent on making this work. So chunk a little bit at a time, but again, we're here for the big finish here, my friend. So
congratulations.
Yeah, congratulations. And like I said, we'll talk offline and probably later today or something. I have some bullet points that I'll send to you also as a part of this the presentation, or everything that was said today. I'll send you a link to a YouTube video so you can go back and hear what we're discussing also,
Mm-hmm.
again, so you can synthesize this. And I think the last thing is, congratulate yourself on this is a major step. I know that it's been on, off, in and out. We're here. So,
All right.
take some pride in that. And like I said, we'll be touching base very soon.
Okay. Thank